Hey, everybody. Welcome back. We're going to do a shorter episode today. It's my intention that hopefully this video will be a little bit quicker, easier for you to make it through this one than the other two. We're going to begin our discussion of research methods in close personal relationships. Um, and we'll start that today and we'll finish it up on next week per the syllabus. Um, so I'm going to jump right in that, see if I can get my screen shared here. Okay. So before we begin, I want to start by giving just a couple brief announcements. So first thing, I have really enjoyed reading your Two Truths and a Lie. So if you haven't done that, please chime in. Feel free to make some guesses on your classmates. But also make sure to swing back by and tell us about your Two Truths and a Lie. Tell us, first of all, which is a lie, but many of you have some very interesting truths for sure. So tell us what's up with that. I, for one, have been really enjoying reading them, and so thank you. So swing back by the end of this week and stop in that forum. Do make sure if you have questions on the material or if you have something to add, feel free to do that. Each of these episodes, this will be episode 3, has a companion discussion board that goes along with it. So if you do have questions, you have comments, you have things you want to add, please do um, swing by and add something there. I'm checking out the forums pretty regularly, trying to stay on top of everything, and so far it's been a lot of fun. I appreciate your involvement, uh, and uh, and so this should be good. Um, Today, I really just want to talk about a few things regarding pertaining to research methods. And the first thing we're going to talk about is why do we even care that you understand research methods? Most of you have by now taken Com 300. You had that with either Dr. Tambrini or Dr. Bergen. And uh, if I'm not mistaken, your reaction to me saying research methods is not a favorable one. That's a pretty common response in undergraduates all over the world, and yet um, in most social science majors, there is some required methodological component. So you might be wondering to yourselves, I think it would be legitimate for you to wonder to yourselves, why on earth do we make you learn about this thing that we know you hate? And believe it or not, there are some really good reasons. I've got a few of them here. I'll go through those, but there are a few others that I'll share with you as well. First of all, research methods are always in the news, right? All of the time, the news is our journalists are talking about studies that scholars have published, and sometimes lately, the news has been about studies that have not even been published or have been through peer review yet. So understanding research methods is at I would argue is the most at its most important right now in the history of the world. What's happened due to a movement called the open science movement is that scholars have begun sharing their results before those results have even passed muster. So those results have not been reviewed by a community of those researchers' peers. Now, the reason that it becomes really important that people like you can understand research methods is many times the journalists who report on these white papers don't understand research methods, and they're just looking for newsworthy stuff. So it becomes really important for consumers of news to be able to meaningfully and thoughtfully understand and be able to unpack what research really means, right? It's just one of the most important things that you can possibly do and be able to do. Um, so, yeah, research methods always being in the news is a huge reason that you really need to understand research methods. And then, frankly, there's a lot of misinformation out there. Not always is it the case that the researchers themselves are responsible for misinformation. Many times, the research that they have done is perfectly good research. I published a study one time that was about the what you could tell from photos versus what a person says about themselves, or how people formed impressions on the basis of that information that you share on social media websites, right? Um, and I published this study with some fairly intricate results. And those intricate results matter. The intricacies of those results mattered quite a bit. When it made it out into the news, however, and there was a whole big press release. I was working at a university to the south of here in Columbus, Ohio, for a while. After I graduated actually. I don't know that I've ever told you that. I graduated in 2009 with my PhD from Michigan State. My first job was at Ohio State, where my wife got her PhD. And so the public relations office, they do have a very good public relations office at Ohio State. They got a hold of my research results, and they submitted a press release. And before I knew it, like within a day, I had telephone calls from like probably 20 or 25 researchers that I had, or pardon me, 20 or 25 journalists, the New York Times, the Washington Post, all these places want to, and it's not because I'm anything special. I'm not. It's just that it was a slow news day, and this news came out. So I get a bunch of calls, and some of the reporters are perfectly kind people. Had a couple really nice conversations, and then I saw the pieces that they wrote, and they bore very little resemblance to the actual research that I had conducted, right? So there's a ton of misinformation out there, and I don't think any of those journalists intended to send fake news out into the world. It wasn't. They were just trying to get it right, but also simplify it. Now, the problem was, in the process of simplifying it, they oversimplified it. And so misinformation can creep out sometimes even from people with very good intentions. And those of you who have seen your in-laws and families, extended families, Facebook feeds, you understand how this can happen pretty readily, right? There's a lot of misinformation that can creep out. And if you have a good understanding of the study of research methods and also the way research is conducted, you're able to go back to the original source and evaluate, hey, is this really what happened, what I'm being told, or is the story a little bit more complex? So that's another reason why understanding research methods is pretty important. And then finally, relationship science affects us personally, right? The stuff that we're going to be learning about in this class, this is not just arcane garbage that's built to sit on a shelf. Relationship science is science that has a day-to-day effect, and it's not always immediately apparent and obvious things that we'll be learning about, right? If all of relationship science was, hey, just use common sense and be nice to people all the time, there would be very little interest in relationship science. But that's not what relationship science tells us. It's way more complex and way more interesting than just that. So it's important to understand these research methods so that you can understand the complexity that is human beings and apply the complexity of human relationships to your own relationships. So there's several other reasons why it's really important to understand research methods. We'll dive into more of them, and I can share those with you. But these are the big ones, right? So today we're going to talk about a few things in the research process. First, we're probably going to talk today only about developing a question, and we're going to consider the way we obtain participants to answer a question. Now, then following that on next week, early next week, I'll post another episode about choosing a design, selecting a setting, dealing with data, and some ethical issues as they relate to relationship science. Okay. But today we're going to focus on developing a question and obtaining participants. Excuse me. So developing a question in relationship science is really the first step in not just relationship science, but in any good science. We develop a question. We start off with a question, and we call that question a research question. Generally speaking, research questions are quite broad, and they can come from a number of places. One common place that a research question comes from is from the researcher's personal experience. I mean, I'd be lying to you if I told you that all of my research questions sort of came out of the ether and from theoretical inquest and all this kind of stuff. No, a lot of times I just kind of look around and I think, that's neat. I didn't expect that to happen. I wonder what's making that happen. Now, it's also true that I've got a pretty healthy background in social scientific theory, and so I can start to see some things that happen that shouldn't happen according to extant theory. And we'll get into theory a little bit more in just a moment. But to be really honest with you, a lot of the things that I'm interested in because I've had these personal experiences in my life, right? One of the reasons I'm so interested in the way impressions are formed in online spaces, and this is one of my personal areas of research interest, is that back when I was 18, I was probably 19 at the time, summer after my freshman year of college, I was back home, and at that point, my home was in Montana. I was working on a potato farm, and I didn't have a whole lot of connection with much of the rest of the world. And so I would get on America Online. This is back in the day when America Online was like an actual internet provider and a whole online service, and there were chat rooms, and it was as geeky as it sounds. But I would use dial-up, and I'd get on America Online, and I'd hop into a chat room, and I would be lying if I told you I was there for a reason that wasn't meeting girls my age. Which in retrospect, I get it. This is probably not the best idea, right? But this is where we were. So honestly, one of the things that I'm most curious about comes from one of the research questions: how do we form impressions of other people, especially when we're seeking to form an impression of a person we are looking to develop a relationship with, and sometimes a romantic relationship with. Research is me search, right? I look into my own life, and I use that as a generator for research ideas. Another place that research questions often come from is from previous research experiences. Okay, from previous research experiences. So if you're a person like me and you spend a lot of your life reading journal articles and reviewing journal articles, often what will happen as you read a journal article is you have a question. Many of you a couple of you thus far as I've been looking at some of the discussion posts about the back burner article that you have to read for and write a response for this week in the weekly discussion readings forum, have already noticed this, right? You've read that research and you've identified, hey, there's this question. I wonder if um, these research results are incomplete. And I wonder if we changed the sample in a certain way, or if we looked at a certain other thing, whether we wouldn't be able to understand even better this whole concept of back burner relationships, or you were surprised by one of the findings or something like that, right? Previous research can really drive future research questions. Another thing that can drive research questions, and for those of you who are interested in things like health communication or political communication, social problems often drive research questions. There's a lot of people who, for many years, have been interested um, in the problems of tobacco use and diseases caused by tobacco use. Right, this is one of the probably one of the most common forms of health communication is campaigns against tobacco use, because we just know tobacco causes all sorts of problems with your body and is probably going to kill you in the long run, right? I don't think I'm telling any secrets here. I think we all pretty much know that. So that we have this social problem, yet in a free society, we've decided that we probably just we shouldn't just say you can't ever do this, you can't ever be involved in this, although to be really honest with you, that probably has more to do with money and how it's related to tobacco farms and how that's generational wealth. And at any rate, before I hop off on a huge tangent, we've got the social problem. People use tobacco, yet we know that it will kill them, right? So that can lead to all sorts of interesting research questions. We've got other examples. We know that there are plenty of environmental causes of breast cancer, right? So one of the most common things that you've probably heard of with regard to breast cancer is that it's at some level it's genetic, right? Which means if you have a family member who has had breast cancer, you're at increased risk. Well, that's true, but it's also true that there are tons of environmental causes that put you at even more risk. Or even if you weren't at risk due to a family member having had breast cancer, you're still going to be at risk because of the environmental causes that you're subject to, right? So this is a social problem that, as a communication scholar, we might ask a research question like, how do we help people understand the environmental risks associated with contracting breast cancer, right? And to be honest with you, our department has been a part of a large interdisciplinary team that has done enormous amounts of research and has been funded to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. Don't get excited. We don't actually get to see most of that money. Most of that money is going to medical schools across the country help to help fund research into this. But a small portion of it goes to answering questions about how do we communicate the science of what we know out to the public, right? So social problems, another social problem in close personal relationships is, hey, Americans are getting divorced like crazy. This is a problem. We don't want to keep that happening. So what's causing divorce in America? Why is divorce in America happening at a far greater rate than it is in almost any other country in the world, right? So all of these things are important questions that arise from social problems that we can address through research. And then finally, research questions come from theories. So as I sort of alluded when I was talking about personal experience, um, theories provide sort of fertile ground for us to think about what we already know. And when we observe the world, we might say to ourselves, what I just watched happen in real life is inconsistent with what theory tells me should have happened, right? Well, that allows us to ask poignant questions and challenging questions of the theories that exist. Sometimes theories themselves are not consistent with one another. And when that happens, researchers like myself get really excited because we get to pit one theory against another and we get to see which one is right. We get to develop a study that tests when one theory starts and another theory stops. So there's a number of places, but these are the big ones where research questions come from. Okay, so we've decided on what a research question is. Our next step in the scientific process is we need to figure out how to get what we're going to study, right? We have to determine where is it the best, and also where is it the most convenient to find things to study. Now, if you're a plant biologist, my next door neighbor who lives literally 30 feet back that way, great guy. He's a faculty member, so he's a retired faculty member at MSU, and his area of study is plant breeding, right? Now, when he wants to study plants and the genetics of plants, he can go out just south of campus where there are tons of plants. Some of those laboratories are even his own, right? And getting subjects is not hard at all for him. Now, when we're social scientists, we have to work a little bit harder because our subjects are actually people. Now, I will also pause here to say there are a number of new approaches to social science that are also super interesting that tell us things that we might not otherwise know. Um, and things like agent-based modeling. So agent-based modeling builds computer programs to kind of act like people do on a societal level and allows us to, for instance, simulate the way that diseases can spread in a population. Now, the benefit of doing it this way, doing it using a computer program, is we don't actually have to spread a disease in the population in order to understand how diseases spread in a population. I think you'd probably agree with me. It's probably pretty beneficial for us to study a thing safely before we have to study it in a dangerous way, right? So there are other approaches, and but mostly in social science, we're studying people, and that means we need people to participate in our research. We have a number of ways of doing that. I will also say at the outset of this brief discussion about obtaining participants that my discussion of this is heavily tilted toward um, empirical, quantitative, social scientific methods. As most of you know about our department values empirical, quantitative social science. That's what we are. And so we obtain participants social scientifically, or pardon me, we obtain participants. When I talk about the way we obtain participants, I'm mostly going to be talking about the way we obtain participants in the kinds of studies that we tend to do in the Department of Communication at Michigan State. There are other kinds of studies that do things a little bit differently, but I'm mostly focusing on that because that's who we are. Okay. So the first thing I'd point out in talking about obtaining participants, if I want to know how the United States of America, all the people in the United States of America react to something, there are a number of ways of going about that, right? I could try to measure, let's say, well, let's see, what's a good example? if I were curious, if my research, this is going to be a stupid research question, but just bear with me. If I were curious, um, what everybody in the United States of America thought about, what's a good example? Oh, I like Dave Chappelle. So we'll say Dave Chappelle. For those of you who aren't familiar, which probably not many of you, but Dave Chappelle is a popular and brilliant comedian. He does tell dirty jokes, so if you don't like dirty jokes, don't watch, I guess. But if you do like dirty jokes, Dave Chappelle's pretty great. And he's also super smart and insightful and a brilliant commenter on the condition of life for a Black person in middle America. Right? He lives in Ohio. He lives in a small town not far from where I lived in Ohio, and just smart dude. So if we were curious, hey, what is America? What do Americans think broadly? Do they like Dave Chappelle? It's a stupid research question for the purposes of an actual communication study, but bear with me, right? If we wanted to know what Americans thought of Dave Chappelle, we could go about the business of asking every single American what they think of Dave Chappelle, right? Um, there are some problems with that. First of all, it's going to be super expensive for us to ask every single American what they think of Dave Chappelle, right? Well, first of all, I would have to have a list of every single American. And such a list is awfully hard to come by. You might think, well, just go to go to a phone book, or you guys probably don't commonly use phone books, neither do I. Um, used to be in the olden days, these big books were delivered to our houses. I know you know this. Um, and it would be a list of most every person with a phone number, but there's a problem with that. Not everybody has a phone. Now, certainly not everyone has a landline, and very certainly, even 20 years ago, not everyone had a phone. There are many people who were just not wealthy enough to have phones and didn't have home phones. Right? There are homeless people. There are people with unlisted numbers. So, could we be sure that we got everyone? And even if we were sure that we had a list of every single American, right? And going out to ask each and every one of them what they think of Dave Chappelle is going to take a really long time. It's going to cost a whole lot of money. It's just not efficient. So instead, what we commonly do is we sample, right? We sample um, participants rather than take a census, which is um, if we were to actually go out and ask everybody in the population, that's really what the census is. You probably have seen information about the census recently, because that's sort of been a thing that's been ongoing also, as we've been collecting census data. Because the census happens every 10 years in the United States. So um, in our in our the way that we collect participants, typically speaking, in social science, is that we sample participants. In other words, we take a small subset of the overarching population. We take what we learn in that sample and we apply it to the population. We get an estimate for what the population thinks. Okay? That's that's why we sample. Another question that we need to ask ourselves when we obtain participants is, whose relationships get studied, right? Now, in a perfect world, um, we would always choose a random sample of our population. So a random subset selected from our population. Um, and I'm trusting that this is at some level review for most of you. And so I'll go fairly quickly. But if you have questions, post them to the discussion board. I'm happy to jump in there too. Uh, a truly random sample is pretty hard to come by. Okay. In order to have a truly random sample, we would need a list of everyone who exists in the population, and everyone who exists in the population would have to have an equal chance of being selected to be a part of that sample. Okay. So we would have to have a list of everyone in the population, and everyone on that list would need to have an equal chance of being selected to be a part of the sample. So right off the bat, that's pretty difficult. We don't have an accurate list of the entire population. Even most of the things that you think of as a pretty good list are incomplete. So we could go to voter registration records, but that's not everyone in the population. That excludes people who are not US citizens. It excludes people who just haven't bothered to register to vote. It excludes a lot of folks that it's probably not such a good idea to exclude it if we care about our sample representing the entirety of the population, right? So another thing that we could do is, or we would need to do, you might think of to gather a random sample, look at something like a phone book. Well, we've talked about the reasons that phone books are problematic. So most of the things that we talked about being problematic have to do with us being able to ensure that the randomness of our sample is truly random, right? So if there would be a reason, a systematic reason, that a person were to be left off of a list um, of every single person in the United States of America, then even if we are adequately able to randomly select people from the list that we have, if the list that we have ourselves is not fair, then our selection isn't fair either. It systematically excludes some people. Um, and so this is why developing a random sample is very difficult. Now, there are places, and they are expensive to work with. There are companies that work with researchers, though, to come as close as they possibly can to giving us a random sample of Americans, right? Uh, it is exceptionally costly to work with these kinds of companies. So most of the research, I will argue, that happens in communication science and especially relationship science does not use a random sample, even though it would be optimal. So the upside of random sample, it's honestly, it's the best thing that you can get um, if you want to make a, a judgment that you can apply back to a population, right? It's the best thing there is. It's the gold standard, no question. A nationally representative sample that's truly random is the best thing you can have if you want to be able to say things about an entire population. The problem is it's super expensive, prohibitively expensive. There are folks whose research is funded. I'm thinking of a couple scholars at other institutions um, who swear by nationally representative samples when they conduct even experiments, which is great that they're able to do that. I think that's phenomenal for them. It's just not a reality for most of us. A convenient sample is, kind of on the other end of the spectrum. A convenient sample is selecting a sample of a group of people who are merely convenient to you, or are convenient in some way. So those of you who have taken part in SONA research through the Department of Communications SONA pool, you probably have identified already that that is a convenient sample. We're convenient sampling from students who exist in the department And we give you course credit or extra credit sometimes for taking part. Um, I have not added you guys to the Sona pool yet, although I may offer it. If I do, it will not be a required part of the class. It'd just be for extra credit. I will decide that, and I will let you know. But you would be a part if you chose to take part in that. If we do it to get extra credit, um, you would be part of a convenience sample, right? And so the nice thing about a convenience sample, and there are really nice things about convenience samples, don't get me wrong, is they are cheap. They are, frankly, most of the time they're generated for free, which is, I think, a really good thing. It's a huge upside, especially for people who do a lot of experimental work, which is what I do mostly. Because when you do experimental work, you're concerned a little bit less with the nature of the population you're experimenting with, and you're concerned much more with the nature of your experimental inductions. All of that will become clear in episode number 4. I'm kind of foreshadowing a little bit. But there's some good reasons, especially with experimental work. Convenience samples are less problematic. Now, convenience samples are quite bad and typically biased if our goal is to take a measurement. So for our research study about how much do Americans like Dave Chappelle, a convenience sample is probably not going to be super effective. Okay. And the reason for that is, relatively simple. You guys are, as on the whole, um, a, a fairly open-minded and somewhat ethnically diverse group. You're going to be probably fairly open to the kinds of things Dave Chappelle has to say. And if he drops an F-bomb here and there, you're not going to write him off. Now, if I were to conduct a convenient sample survey of the people in this class, I would imagine that most of you, even though he may say some things, he definitely will say some things that many of you shouldn't say. Me too. But you will probably acknowledge his right to say the stuff he says and the way he says it, and you will be able to, even if you don't enjoy, you may be able to appreciate, right? Now, there are some folks that are not like you. And so by convenient sampling only you, I'm probably going to get an overestimation of what America thinks of Dave Chappelle by only asking college students. You may also think he's old because he's closer to my age than he is to yours. And at any rate, in terms of representing the population's viewpoint, your perspective from a convenience sample is likely to be quite biased, right? It's not going to give me a very good estimate. In that case, it's really important that we use something more representative. And that's where we get to a representative sample. Now, I want to point out that a representative sample is not a random sample, right? A representative sample is not a random sample. And there are a number of ways that we can achieve representativeness in samples. We can achieve representativeness in samples by, honestly doing a wide range of things. We could employ a number of characteristics. We could use a quota sample. I'm not concerned that you understand what all of these things are, by the way, but we could use a quota sample. We could use a stratified, that would actually be a random sample, stratified random sampling. We could do a number of mechanisms to get a representative sample so that our sample represents some set of demographics that we decide ahead of time, right? And a representative sample is not quite as good as a random sample, but it's certainly better than a convenience sample at being able to make a reflection and tell something to a researcher about the characteristics of a population. Okay. It's not nearly as costly to come up with a representative sample as it is to come up with a random sample. So that's a real benefit of representative sampling. Now, if I'm doing experimental work, there's not probably as much benefit to conducting a representative sample, as a convenient sample will work just fine. So really, whose relationships get studied, who we select to be a part of our sample, has a lot to do with what our research question is and how we're going to go about answering that research question. There are good reasons to choose a random sample if it's very important that we have a clear understanding of what the population thinks and what the population believes. Then a random sample is really important, right? If it's more important that we understand the nature of some variables against one another, or a co-relationship of two variables with one another, then a convenient sample done with an experiment can be pretty effective, right? So it's all of there are positives and negatives with each of these types of sampling. Probably from expense is probably the most important thing, right? So random samples are the most expensive. Representative samples are a little bit less expensive, kind of a middle ground, and then convenient samples are least expensive. And what you buy with your research dollars then is how well your data represent the population as the whole. Okay. So there's potential problems. We've actually gone over potential problems with convenience and representative sampling. And there are challenges likewise with random sampling, mostly cost. So with that, I'm going to finish for today. And next time, we will pick back up with choosing a design, selecting a setting, dealing with data, and talking about ethical issues. So with that, I'll finally point you to, there will be an episode 3 discussion forum. If you have questions about this, if I've covered anything too quickly, you can always rewind me, go back and make me say it again. That's one of the beauties of everybody having a recording. But please do that. And hey, the other thing is, hopefully the weather is going to hold this week while you're watching this. Go outside and take a walk. Be safe and stay away from people, but get some vitamin D. I read a study today that told me that vitamin D and having adequate amounts of vitamin D present in your system, which comes from sun exposure, healthy sun exposure, but comes from sun exposure, is one of the biggest things you can do to ward off complications from COVID-19. So I don't know if that's true or not, because I didn't actually read the study, but it sounds like a good idea to me, just to get outside and be safe, but also enjoy the weather. All right, we'll talk to you guys next time. Goodbye.